Yes, we are now recording. There we go. Okay, wonderful. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Jim Ryan. I am the Associate Director of the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies at NYU, and I want to welcome you all here to our first online virtual panel. And I really am very pleased to see a wide amount of interest and to have two very timely and important presentations from two distinguished colleagues of ours on the history of quarantine and epidemics in the Middle East. Just a few words about how this is going to go before we get started. We're going to have two presentations from Professors Alex Chase-Levenson and Laura Goffman that will last about 20 minutes each. They'll each be sharing their screen while they present because they have PowerPoint presentations, and then we'll come back to the full meeting afterwards. I do ask that everyone in the meeting remains muted throughout those presentations. And then after both presentations are finished, that's both presentations are finished, so probably around 12:40, we will open up to Q&A. And I want to offer folks three different modes of asking a question if they would like to ask a question. They may use the raise your hand function, and myself or one of the co-hosts will unmute you so you can ask your question. You may send a question to the public chat that is in the little box on the side of your screen, and we will read your question from there. Or if you would like to ask a question anonymously, you may send a private message to myself with your question so that so I can ask it to one of our participants. So those are the ground rules, and I would like to now I'm going to introduce both speakers, and then that way we can just flow from one to the next here. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Alex Chase-Levenson. He is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is the author of a very timely, very newly released book, The Yellow Flag, Quarantine and the British Mediterranean World, released, I believe, in March from Cambridge University Press. And he is now working on a new project about British strategies, fantasies, and fears regarding borders in the long 19th century. And then our second speaker, moving forward in time and over to the Persian Gulf, is going to be Dr. Laura Goffman. She is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Cultural Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo. She's joining us from Oslo. And her research focuses on the social history of health and disease in the modern Persian Gulf and Arabian Peninsula regions. She is an alumni of our Kevorkian Center master's program, so we're very, very glad to be bringing her back here in celebration of that. And she has also recently defended her dissertation from Georgetown University. So congratulations to Laura again on that. And further, and most importantly, beginning in August of this year, she will officially begin her position as the Assistant Professor of Health Studies in the Middle East and North Africa School at the University of Arizona. So we are very, very lucky to have both of them here with us, two scholars working on very, very timely issues given everyone's current situation. And I am happy to get this thing rolling. Alex, if you could share your screen and take it away.
Thank you so much. Well, I will try to, is that sharing this screen? Okay. Well, thank you all for zooming in, and thanks, Jim, for the invitation. The modern period, Alison Bashford reminds us, in general, is an age of universal contagion, but also a time when contagion was unevenly distributed, has been. We can, and in the time of coronavirus we do, Think about such epidemiological divides among neighborhoods, among classes, among races, among continents. And in this regional geographical mode, so it was between Europe and the Middle East in the 19th century regarding that most basic and fearsome of contagions, bubonic plague. In many ways, the evolution of this disparity takes us through the birth of modernity itself. The last major plague in the West was the 1720 plague of Marseilles and Provence. There was a plague of Messina in Sicily in 1744, and in 1815, the very little known last plague epidemic on continental European soil occurred in the tiny Pulian coastal town of Noia, what's now Noi-Cattaro in southern Italy. By contrast, significant plague epidemics occurred almost yearly somewhere in the Ottoman Empire, right up through the 1840s. And particularly so, there's a very intense period of epidemics in the first quarter of the 19th century. So Istanbul suffered one of the worst epidemics in its history, losing about a quarter of its population in 1812, 1813, Izmir in the same year, Aleppo in 1814 and 1827, and there was a major Egyptian plague that killed thousands of people in Alexandria and Cairo in 1835. These are illustrative examples, far from a comprehensive listing. As the disparity between the plague-free West and the apparently plague-stricken East became increasingly clear in the 18th century, the quarantine system that had built up slowly in the harbors of the Mediterranean became a strict border between East and West, one that forced every single ship, every trade good, every letter, every sailor, every traveler, every passenger into a weeks-long detention. Mandatory quarantine was imposed on all ships, so even those that left a Middle Eastern port not infected with plague. In the parlance of quarantine diplomacy, these ships had clean bills of health, classified as clean as opposed to foul, suspected or touched, and all of these relate to the number of plague cases in the city of departure. So a clean bill of health meant there was absolutely no report of plague. You were still quarantined for about 3 weeks in most European ports. This system lasted about as long as major plague epidemics afflicted Middle Eastern port cities. Though isolated epidemics continued to occur in Ottoman hinterlands in the second half of the 19th century, so particularly there's a plague epidemic in eastern Libya in the 1850s, in Mesopotamia in the 1860s and 70s. After about 1840, the cities from which major trade with Europe was conducted were mostly immune to large outbreaks of disease. But thinking about the first half of the 19th century, and in this time, so robust did the quarantine system become that in the view of its defenders, and it was always controversial, to be European was to quarantine. Health board officials routinely referred to their practice as, quote, the sanitary system of Europe. In order to ensure that their own ships would be received in other European harbors with no delays, Western governments were forced to adhere to minimum standards of security. In this way, an incentive existed for all European boards of health and all port cities to loudly trumpet one's adherence to shared norms, to adhere to minimum standards, and to insist on an exception-free cordon sanitaire against the South and East. In this way, the maritime and land borders between Western and Central Europe on the one hand and the Ottoman Empire on the other developed into a medical line infused with symbolism, a clear boundary of demarcation enforced by quarantine. Questions medical and cultural became intermingled. So today I'm asking a couple of questions. So within Ottoman cities themselves, how did plague serve as a way of emphasizing communal divides? And how did sickness inflect Western evaluations of Ottoman progress? So situated in the first half of the 19th century, my talk explores how plague infused civilizational evaluations in an era of increasing European commercial penetration in the Eastern Mediterranean, and in which the fate of the Ottoman Empire became a very common and open question among British and French strategists, so the so-called Eastern question. In more ways than one then, this was an era in which the question of the health of the so-called sick man of Europe became a clear matter of Western strategic interest. For travelers, to depart from the world of European sanitary security became imbued with a language of risk and guilt. One medical traveler observed that on the Russian side, a road that crossed the Russo-Ottoman border near Galatz had been given the name the Clean Way, as an ironic nod to the fact that, as this traveler put it, quote, "The road conducts the traveler, whom business or curiosity may tempt to leave the healthy regions into the country of pestilence." Another British traveler, the popular travel writer Alexander Kinglake, said that crossing into an Ottoman barge at a frontier station of the Habsburg Empire was a particularly significant experience. And this opens his very popular travel narrative, Eothen. He says, an Austrian border official presided over his traveling party and asked, quote, "If you have done with the civilized world," with as much solemnity as if we had been departing from this life. And Kinglake concludes, "It is plague and the dread of the plague that divide the one people from the other," and not least because of the very onerous quarantine all travelers had to experience on their way back to Europe. Medico-cultural borders like this, though, were reproduced within the Ottoman Empire itself, where Western expatriates, who in a kind of nod to romantic crusader language often refer to themselves as Franks, so where Franks developed a tradition of marking themselves off within the cities they lived in, an urban pattern dictated again by plague and the dread of the plague. So elite Western merchants and diplomats adopted a process almost every year during the months of the summer and early fall of plague season, of totally secluding their houses in a ritual commonly called shutting up. Well, this is something I'd say that we are excessively familiar with today. So during plague season, those shutting up in the early 19th century barred their doors, received no visitors. They admitted groceries and other supplies only via a basket and pulley system or through small slots in the door. Shut up merchants in Aleppo, as one British doctor recorded, typically received letters with a pair of iron tongs and fumigated them with vinegar and sulfuric smoke before opening. Observers described how merchants divided themselves up into small groups, chose the individual with the largest house, and shut themselves up together. Given that even this attempt to ward off boredom became irksome after a while, Dr. Russell, this British doctor who lived in Aleppo for about 30 years, noted that some people called on other parties via roof terraces, but he warned against this laxity. Quote, "Yet when the plague rages much, it is reckoned safest not to trust anyone, lest they should be guilty of irregularities." This absolutist approach often left more recent so-called Frankish arrivals disoriented. The medical traveler R.R. Madden lamented that his arrival in Alexandria coincided with the beginning of a plague outbreak. Quote, "Every Frank was in quarantine, the hotel was declared infected, and a lodging was nowhere to be found." Forced to return to his ship, Madden was eventually given refuge by an English merchant who, to adapt a current term, allowed him into what we might call his bubble, said, "You can live with me during plague season." And again, in a way that might resonate with us in the midst of an epidemic, Madden noted that the conversation throughout the months that followed centered to a maddening degree upon folk wisdom about avoiding plague. Madden wrote, "The laws of infection were handled by young ladies in the drawing room. A cat could communicate the plague, but a dog was less dangerous. An ass was a pestiferous animal, but a horse was non-contagious. If you complained of a headache, there was a general flight. If you went abroad with a sallow cheek, people fled in all directions. Heaven preserve you from shutting up in Egypt. It is not the death of one's neighbors which is so overcoming, but the horror of eternally hearing about the plague, the terror of contagion depicted on every face." These self-quarantines severely disrupted the social and economic life of major Middle Eastern cities. Ottoman traders complained about the reduction in business, while so many clients, Western clients, retired to their houses, and some Western doctors accused local governments of concealing reports of plague because of this risk. Indeed, shutting up could last for months, much longer, in fact, than quarantine on a return journey to Western Europe. And we can imagine how much this meant for a hypothetical traveler, how much of the year would have been then spent in quarantine. So between several months shut up in a major Ottoman city, if you were traveling back and forth from a European city, you might spend about 6 months of the year in some kind of medical detention. The energy behind sticking to this grueling regimen came from a number of cautionary anecdotes, frequently repeated by travelers. One popular story concerned a merchant who, having shut himself up in a house in Alexandria, arranged to break his self-quarantine only to receive a haircut. A desire, certainly I understand, as it has been several months. But in any case, this individual stuck his head out of a small door he built into a small gate into his door that he built for the purposes of getting a haircut, stuck his head out and paid a barber to come and cut his hair. However, warns one author, he paid dearly for his folly. He died a few days after. Travel narratives contain records of how European boarding houses went to extreme lengths to preserve separate geographies of security and suspicion during times of plague. The artist Francis Hervé, who lived for some months in Istanbul in the 1830s, wrote that each time he returned to his hotel, he was, quote, compelled to undergo the operation of perfuming, or rather fumigating. For this purpose, he goes on, you enter a sort of sentry box, and I found a picture of what this must have looked like. Hervé says, you enter a sort of sentry box where you stand on an iron grating under which herbs are burnt, and there you remain, putting your head out of a hole as if in a pillory, till it is considered that you are sufficiently purified. So plague problematized touch above all. Contagion theory at the time suggested physical touch was the preeminent source of contagion. Hervé aptly described plague as a most antisocial malady. And there is clear evidence that many Ottomans resented the elaborate rituals Western European expats often went to insist on their separateness in times of plague. So Alexander Kinglake describes flirting with a young Turkish woman on a street in Istanbul when she suddenly touched his arm and said plague and laughed. This, Kinglake grumbled, was a common Turkish joke, but we can see here a clear sense that Western paranoia felt degrading. At the same time, we can also detect from many of these same travel narratives a sense that the old canard, many of them continue to advance about Islamic fatalism, an idea that Muslim residents of the Ottoman Empire never took any measures against the plague, with a sense that their fate was preordained, so to flee or seclude was wrong. The same travel narratives often show evidence that this was not at all the case. So Hervé goes on to say, many people concealed their diseases not really for economic reasons, but because if the Ottoman government got wind of a plague victim in Istanbul, at least, many of them were often hauled off to the Greek pest house, a fate many considered to be worse than death. A Captain Franklin, a traveler who traveled in Eastern Anatolia and Syria in the late 1820s, noted that individuals from infected areas were often marked out by being forced to carry yellow sticks, indicating they were either infected with plague or had come from a house where someone else was infected with plague. If this anecdote is true, that would involve a vast kind of contact tracing regime, a vast government surveillance effort to marking out the plague, to enforcing a kind of separation of who was potentially risky and who was safe. Numerous travelers note that by the 1830s, many elite Muslims and Greeks shared the tradition of shutting up with Western merchants. In some then, when it came to responding to the plague, the sense that Western Europeans clung to of a kind of distinctiveness was more or less illusory. From the color of yellow being used to signify isolation, a yellow flag is the classic quarantine flag, to the reliance on isolation hospitals in the time of epidemics, Ottoman and Western European practices regarding the plague were coming increasingly to resemble each other. By the end of the 1830s, this trend can be seen in the most consequential way possible when the Ottoman state itself enacted a major quarantine reform that meant Mediterranean shores were now united in sharing common prophylactic techniques against the plague. Quarantine had been instituted for most arrivals in Egypt after 1831, and despite that system's catastrophic failure in the plague of 1835, Italian doctors who were in charge of the Lazaretto of Alexandria enumerated about a dozen cases of plague patients arriving in quarantine, spreading the plague in a limited way in the Lazaretto, the quarantine station of Alexandria, and the disease being stopped there. So they claimed this showed that quarantine was effectively protecting Egypt in most cases. A British doctor noted a case in Istanbul's new quarantine facilities in 1841 when a ship with plague arrived. 2 quarantine employees caught it and died. And against the loud voices of anti-contagionist doctors, so opponents of quarantine who said plague always spreads through environment, through weather, through miasma, kind of gases, not through contagion, so quarantine would be useless if you believe that. So against that kind of argument, this Dr. Davy claimed may it not be concluded as a thing certain that if these two men had not communicated with the persons and effects brought on the infected vessel, they, in common with the whole population of the city and its suburbs, amounting, it is estimated, to about 800,000 souls, would have remained free from the disease. So with slightly awkward wording, Davies' argument is clearly that quarantine spared the lives of many of those 800,000 souls. So if the first 2/3 of my talk have established that in the Western imagination, if not in actuality, plague prevention constituted a civilizational dividing line, in what remains of my time, I'd like to investigate how the presence of major plague epidemics in Ottoman cities shaped Western evaluations of the empire more broadly. With the obligation to perform quarantine on return from Middle Eastern travel so central in the minds of travelers, it's not surprising that many treated the plague itself as a kind of tourist attraction, something exotic and evocative. And we can certainly see that with Kinglake's scenario. So Kinglake says, as soon as he gets to Istanbul, all the while that I stayed at Constantinople, the plague was prevailing, but not with any degree of violence. Its presence, however, lent a mysterious and exciting, though not very pleasant, interest to my first knowledge of a great Oriental city. It gave a tone and color to all I saw and all I felt, a tone and color somber enough but true and well befitting the dreary monuments, as he describes them, of past power and splendor. With all that is most truly Oriental in character, Kinglake wrote, the plague is associated. So decline, degeneration, despotism. Ideas that for many Westerners in the first half of the 19th century could be associated both with the plague and with critiques of the Ottoman polity. There are a shockingly huge number of travel narratives, actually, that dive into these kind of vast efforts to diagnose the kind of state of the Ottoman polity in general, and kind of broad geopolitical observations occur in a range of narratives, we would say, where the authors, we wouldn't really think of them as being strategists of any kind. Ostensible decline lent itself to metaphors which piqued the imagination. To those who sought a prosaic answer to the Eastern question, it was a source of irritation that the dilemma of Ottoman reform was taken up so often by travelers, that the idea of decline and regeneration was so overladen with exotic metaphors and comparisons. So Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, for example, was certain that, quote, all we hear about the decay of the Turkish Empire and its being a dead body is pure unadulterated nonsense. In another letter, he goes on to say, there is no reason whatever that it should not become a respectable power once again. Half the wrong conclusions at which mankind arrive are reached by the abuse of metaphors. So it may be. But the extent, then, to which the fate of the Ottoman Empire was caught up in dichotomies of West and East, declining, ascending, healthy and sick, clearly irritated Britain's most eminent diplomat, but it also shows us how ubiquitous those kinds of links were. British, French, and Ottoman historians have investigated the history of the Eastern question through such channels as high diplomacy, newspaper, public relations campaigns, and idiosyncratic campaigners. But I'd say popular travel narratives are a kind of neglected but very important source in the history of opinion making regarding the Eastern question, and within them, matters medical and civilizational were routinely intertwined. The interpretations travelers made about recurrent Ottoman plague epidemics, I can stop sharing because that is my last slide. So the interpretations travelers made about recurrent Ottoman plague epidemics served to burnish their opinions about civilizational status more broadly. Plague became a metric through which Western Europeans investigated and considered the question of Ottoman decline and the prospect of Ottoman regeneration. Western European observers found that the Ottoman Empire's status as a quintessential despotism suited its 19th century identification as the apparently sole remaining home of bubonic plague. So primed for tales of Ottoman brutality, especially after the Greek War of the 1820s, Western observers began to consider what they called Oriental despotism to be a kind of predisposing condition that subjected the empire to these recurrent outbreaks of plague. Just so, the French medical writer Alexandre Raymond suggested that general health, as he wrote, is inconsistent with extreme servitude. While numerous travelers who excoriated the Ottoman administration took a ghoulish delight in describing the ubiquity of plague, in presenting stories of dead bodies lining the streets, you're talking about the danger of contagion right there in the most picturesque scenes, describing harrowing presentations of symptoms, A very different response is visible in the travel writing of so-called Turkophiles. So Thomas Thornton, for example, was a Levant company merchant writing in the first decade of the 19th century, who found much to admire in Turkish civilization. He argued that in contrast to British preconceptions about Oriental despotism, in fact, veneration for the law was at the core of Eastern society, and he favorably compared the Persian poet Hafez to Shakespeare, seeking in general to evangelize Islamic literature to the British reading public. It should not surprise us then that his weighty 1807 present state of Turkey is full of attempts to minimize the extent of the plague. In contrast to Europeans, he writes, whose vain terrors and pusillanimous apprehensions during epidemics left them more vulnerable to plague, Thornton argues that, quote, the Turks from temperance, from consequent robustness of constitution, and from firmness of mind frequently escape even if they are infected. Indeed, he emphasized, accepting the plague, Istanbul was a particularly healthy city, and that in 9 cases out of 10, reputed instances of the plague were in fact some other disease that was being misdiagnosed. Thornton was not alone in stressing the positive sanitary aspects of Turkish society. So citing him, the medical writer Joseph Adam argued that excepting the poor of the Ottoman Empire, few suffer by the plague, and reminding his readers that the now thoroughly respectable doctrine of vaccination had derived from the Turks. Finally, a 19th century edition of the earlier travelers of James Porter, the 18th century travels of James Porter. So this 19th century edition was published with a new preface in the middle of the Crimean War in the 1850s. It espoused a generally pro-Ottoman line, and it praised in extensive detail the salubrious climate of the empire, and suggested that in general the plague had been in retreat as habits had changed. The editor sums up this passage in his preface by voicing confidence, quote, in the permanent regeneration and progress of our ancient ally. So I'm more or less out of time, so I'll stop here, noting that whether with a positive valence or a negative one, plague fighting, plague fear, and plague metaphor became fertile fields through which observers engaged with civilizational divisions across the Mediterranean in the 19th century. And in a way, the fact that the causes of plague were so up for debate at this time, that we have a divide between contagionists who say touch is everything, and anti-contagionists stressing environment and weather, astronomy, all kinds of exhalations from the ground, temperature. The very multifactorialness of these different explanations, I would say, only serve to magnify the kinds of causes one could enumerate if one sought to divine administrative progress or diagnose cultural demerits. The basic structure of Mediterranean quarantine did not discriminate. What mattered was where you came from, not who you were. Yet in providing a routine logistical consequence to an embedded epidemiological imbalance, quarantine clearly helped undergird cultural and political condescension, even as it also clearly, if rarely, served to prevent various plague epidemics from getting worse. Its utility alongside other prophylactic regimes, its limitations and its risks in terms of stigma serve as potent reminders to us now as we go through our own endless saga of shutting up. And now in a different sense, I will shut up, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was great. And I want to welcome folks who came a little late. We're going to be moving on to Dr. Laura Goffman's presentation, and I'll just repeat briefly to remain muted. We'll take Q&A after Dr. Goffman's presentation, and I've posted some instructions for submitting questions in the chat if you want to take note of it there. All right, Laura, would you like to share your screen? We can get started.
All right, how does that look? Okay.
Looks beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim and the Kevo team so much for inviting me here today. As Jim mentioned, I'm a very proud Kevo alum and I'm excited to be back. I wish I were back with all of you in person. I've been following recent events in New York, really with all of you in my thoughts, and I hope that we'll be back with the indoor fountain again soon. I'm a historian of health, and today I'm going to focus on several epidemics in the Persian Gulf region that I analyze in the manuscript I'm currently working on. My goal in the next 20 minutes is to provide 4 brief snapshots of epidemic events alongside state responses and a glimpse of how the region's residents experienced, interacted with, and shaped these processes. So the 4 snapshots are, first of all, imperial quarantines in the early 20th century. Second, I'll look at smallpox and Kuwait's municipal government in 1932. Third, cholera in the development state in 1965. And fourth and finally, anticipating HIV/AIDS and quarantining against moral, as well as medical contamination in the 1980s and 1990s. My first snapshot is of early 20th century quarantine in Muscat. We start in the middle of an April night in 1903, when 5 men from the Omani coastal town of Sur escaped Muscat's quarantine station in a small boat. Sultan Faisal bin Turki was furious. He sent his quarantine superintendent, Ali Salman, to the British agency the next morning to request that the HMS Perseus, at anchor in Muscat's harbor, chase down the truants. The British were primed to acquiesce to his request. The steamship took off down the coast, carrying the quarantine official so that he could identify the missing men. Scanning the coastline, Salman spotted the men through his field glasses. The fugitives could not escape inland as the place where they had landed was overhung by the steep sides of a cliff. Salman recalled the moment of recapture, rather anticlimactically. I called out the name of each and said we had come for them, and they came without further trouble, seeing we were armed. Why would the Sultan and the political agent resort to the extreme measure of calling a British warship to pursue 5 Arab passengers who had broken quarantine? I found no evidence that the protection of Oman from possible diseases these men might have been carrying was their driving motivation. Rather, I argue that by the turn of the century in Muscat, the Sultan's enthusiasm for quarantine enforcement stemmed from his eagerness to demonstrate or perform his sovereignty over Oman's residents to domestic insurgents and imperial officials. In other words, when the 5 Soris dodged quarantine, the Sultan's sovereign claims over the individual residents of Oman was at stake. Quarantines represented one of the heaviest imperial footprints in the Gulf from the late 19th century until World War I. Here I've had on the screen a picture of a 3rd-class quarantine hut at Muscat. Muscat did not have quarantine requirements for 1st and 2nd-class steamship passengers. Bouchier, on the other hand, did, and I put here to show the contrast 1st-class quarantine stations and 3rd-class quarantine huts with the disinfectant station behind the huts on Abasak Island just off of the city. As the region's first public health institutions, quarantine wove Persian Gulf port cities together in a net of interconnected stations at steamship ports of call. Quarantine was a central concern of inter-imperial political debates. It was the initial point of contact between Gulf populations and an emerging idea of state-driven public health. Local rulers in the Persian Gulf seized on quarantine and its sanitary ideologies to escalate their claims over indigenous subjects and territories. Some of the most poignant proof of Gulf and Arabian communities' integration into the world prior to the 20th century, and here I'm arguing against people who claim that basically the Gulf was isolated until oil. So some of the most poignant proof that it wasn't isolated is the massive human toll caused by pandemics in this region. Due to mobilities of traders, pearl divers, slaves, pilgrims, and others between the Gulf, Arabian Peninsula, and Indian Ocean world, residents of this region had long suffered from epidemic diseases. For example, local historians report that in 1773, residents of Basra fleeing plague carried this disease to Kuwait, Qatif, Bahrain, and other Gulf coastal areas. Cholera arrived in the Persian Gulf region in 1820. A little over a decade after this cholera outbreak in 1831, a deadly epidemic of plague swept through the region. The Gulf Coast and Arabian Peninsula also suffered from cholera outbreaks in 1865 and 1871, part of the global pandemics, smallpox epidemics in 1891 and 1893, and a concomitant wave of influenza in 1891. These epidemics, again, offer stark proof that the Arabian Peninsula was not cordoned off from global communications. My point in listing all of these disease outbreaks is to show that epidemic disease was nothing new to the residents of the region, when a network of often competing Ottoman, Qajar, and British quarantine stations emerged around the Gulf in the late 19th century. Rather, what was new about quarantine for local populations was the idea of state-mandated and enforced public health measures that imposed categories of race, class, and gender onto a population long accustomed to freedom of movement between sea and land. Indigenous rulers certainly knew that the sanitary measures they were implementing were the byproduct of imperial politics. But they came to embrace these institutions and their scientific ideologies as mechanisms for the consolidation of their sovereign power over the circulation of Gulf populations. I'd also like to emphasize that in the early 20th century, little effort was made to convince indigenous Gulf residents, such as the men who escaped the Muscat quarantine in 1903, that this increasingly prevalent public health measure might actually benefit and protect local people. As a result, quarantine stations emerged as a public health infrastructure that expressed the coercive powers of elites. But there was no effort to convey the potential health benefits to the target populations themselves. My second snapshot is of a 1932 smallpox epidemic in Kuwait. Here I shift to how indigenous, as opposed to imperial states, responded to an epidemic. The Kuwaiti municipality pursued mass vaccination, even as it partitioned the population into risk categories that were more political than they were epidemiological. At the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s, global depression, the collapse of the pearl market, and Ibn Saud's blockade of Kuwait crippled Kuwait's economy. The merchant community remained politically active in the midst of economic hardship, forming elected councils through the 1930s. The municipality's formative years intersected with the devastating smallpox epidemic of 1932. According to Zahra Frith, the epidemic occurred as refugees of the Ikhwan rebellion against Ibn Saud crowded into Kuwait. One local historian described the beginnings of this catastrophe. The epidemic descended, and Kuwait had no way to prevent it or combat it, except to surrender and allow the epidemic to bring death and deformity to the population. As smallpox cases soared in spring of 1932, the municipality sprang to action. They offered smallpox vaccinations, sometimes by force. They papered the markets with public health announcements and kept records of daily deaths. The sheikh contributed by regularly sending his cars to Basra to bring fresh vaccine serum back to Kuwait. But the lack of ice in Kuwait at that time posed a serious challenge to transporting the vaccination, as high temperatures could reduce the serum's effectiveness. Smallpox killed at least 3,000 people in Kuwait and practically wiped out children between the ages of 3 and 10, in spite of the fact that a good deal of vaccination had been carried out. Here I'd like to emphasize that in 1932, Kuwaitis suffered a massive loss of life, even though they had committed to preventive vaccination measures on a large scale. As a mission doctor later mused, this epidemic did much to discredit vaccination for a while, and no wonder. Alongside such efforts to carry out energetic vaccination, albeit all too often with ineffective vaccines, the municipality also reacted to the smallpox epidemic by expelling certain populations from Kuwait. 1932 had seen the influx of, as a British agent described, some 2,000 starving Persian refugees driven across to the Arab coast from their own country by hunger and the callousness of their own officials. The director of the municipality forced out many of the Iranians who recently had arrived and prevented Iranians from entering Kuwait. He also posted guards at the entrance to the city out of fear of infiltration. These steps reflected the widespread opinion in Kuwait that the epidemic was brought to Kuwait from Persia and its coasts. By the end of August, the sheikh had arranged dhows to convey the poor Iranians free of charge to the left bank of the Shatt al-Arab. In their decision to deport recently arrived impoverished Iranian migrants as an anti-smallpox measure, Kuwait's municipality effectively partitioned the population according to a calculation of risk that privileged political interests over epidemiological considerations. In the wake of the 1932 smallpox epidemic, public health had emerged forcefully as a field of indigenous state intervention. My third snapshot jumps ahead again about 30 years. Kuwait officially became independent in 1961. Just a few years later, in 1965, an outbreak of cholera in neighboring regions tested the burgeoning Kuwaiti biomedical infrastructure. Cholera had appeared on Iran's Afghan frontier in July of 1965. Iranian authorities responded by shutting down communications with its eastern regions, dispatching medical workers, closing schools, banning public gatherings, and imposing quarantines on its borders with Russia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. When Kuwaiti authorities learned of Iran's outbreak, the Ministry of Health decided to halt travel between Kuwait and Iran. The government requested additional vaccine from abroad and ordered vaccination for the entire population of Kuwait, which in 1965 had reached over 467,000. In August, when reports indicated that Iran had managed to control its outbreak, Kuwait did away with restrictions on communications and imports from Iran. But Kuwait continued to require travelers arriving from infected regions to present valid international vaccination certificates. Cholera never reached epidemic levels in Kuwait in 1965, but responding to the threat gave the state an opportunity to flex its expanding medical infrastructure. Apparently, Kuwait's residents were willing participants in these public health measures, perhaps thanks in large part to the long history of vaccinations in Kuwait. According to Dr. Mohammed Hussein Salman, the director of the Ministry of Health's Preventive Services in 1965, quote, "Vaccination is currently being done without resorting to force and compulsion because health awareness in Kuwait has reached an impressive level. The people are coming for vaccination in a manner that is reassuring." My final snapshot fast forwards again to HIV/AIDS, and I focus on the late 1980s and the early 1990s. In Kuwait, to the best of our knowledge, HIV/AIDS never reached epidemic levels among the general population. But the global HIV/AIDS pandemic evoked anxieties that were tied to Kuwait's particular histories of gendered citizenship and dislocations of globalized labor. These anxieties, as I argue in a forthcoming article, were experienced as waiting to be infected, waiting for a national outbreak, waiting in quarantine, and for non-citizens who tested positive on arrival in Kuwait, waiting to be deported. As a media-driven process, this state of waiting and anticipating AIDS distributed the moral and material burden of contagion onto vulnerable populations of non-citizen workers. Certain sexual practices and identities were imagined as something external to the nation. In the HIV/AIDS crisis, quarantines were not only an epidemiological precaution, but a means to cordon off and remove potential moral and social pollutants that might lead citizens astray. In 1986, the Kuwaiti Ministry of Health, in cooperation with the Ministry of Interior, began conducting blood tests to identify HIV carriers among specific categories of migrants. When an incoming migrant tested positive, he or she was held in quarantine until the moment of deportation. In 1993, a journalist visited a 20-year-old HIV-positive Ethiopian woman in quarantine and reported on her situation. The Ethiopian woman was under close surveillance because she reportedly had tried to commit suicide 3 times since discovering her status. The woman described to the journalist how she had been infected. "I had been in a relationship with my friend in Canada. He was married and didn't have children and was separated from his wife. Our intimate relationship was based on a promise of marriage. I had arrived in Kuwait a month ago, when to my shock, I was infected with a disease called AIDS. I am confident that the disease was transmitted to me from my boyfriend." The portrait of this migrant woman, repeatedly attempting to commit suicide while she waits in quarantine for deportation, offers a glimpse of the emotional and psychological experience for some individuals who discovered their HIV-positive status over the course of routine immigration health inspections. The reporter appears to have 2 primary aims in describing this encounter. First, to warn the Kuwaiti readership against engaging in dangerous sexual relationships in the West. The infected and married Canadian boyfriend served as a cautionary tale for innocent young women who might be vulnerable to older, more experienced men. Second, the woman's immobility in quarantine suggests that the government's policies for protecting Kuwait from HIV/AIDS are thorough and effective. The HIV-positive woman is on her way out of the country and is being closely guarded by Ministry of Health employees until her departure. In this case, quarantine protected the national community from contact with someone whose HIV status marked her as both morally and medically undesirable. The surveillance of the woman in quarantine prevented her from committing suicide, at least for as long as she remained in Kuwait. As the journalist explained, that's why I met with her very carefully, for fear of the occurrence of an abomination. Across all 4 of these snapshots, and I'm getting close to the end here, Gulf residents experienced epidemics as processes of anticipating, as much as, and sometimes more than, as epidemiological ruptures. Anticipating disease was not just a matter of public culture or representation, but something deeply imbricated in the process of state power. But even as epidemics were embedded in state power, another interesting pattern emerges across these cases that feels very familiar today. State authorities consistently had limited epidemiological information with which to organize their response to epidemics. Quarantine measures, along with other practices, can appear chaotic and arbitrary. They were often nothing more than a blind lunge by state authorities to grasp more power, to inscribe social categories into biomedical infrastructures, or to stake sovereign claims over territories and populations. What we think of as unbiased scientific understandings of disease and its transmission developed in the midst of these politicized epidemic crises. There often was not a pre-existing body of correct knowledge that states could choose to adhere to or to ignore. Scientific knowledge developed alongside and in conversation with politics. When the Sheikh sent his cars to drive vaccines to Kuwait from Basra in 1932, the serum should have saved lives, according to the best scientific knowledge of the day. In the early years of the HIV/AIDS crisis, it took health officials around the world all too long to realize the importance of testing donated blood. In the initial period of COVID-19 as a pandemic, there was no need to wear masks when we left our homes. Parallels between the 4 epidemic events I highlighted today and COVID-19 are not hard to identify. Racist and classist inequalities, xenophobia and deportations, the rapid respatialization of society in response to fear of contagion, and quarantines are the most obvious example of this, and the interplay of public trust in medical technologies and state efforts to manage health at the level of the population. Quarantine measures today, as in Muscat in 1903, are structurally racist and classist, and implicitly grant more value to some lives over others. Disadvantaged populations with worse nutrition and less access to clean air, clean water, and preventive medicine are the most susceptible to the comorbidities that result in the greatest loss of health and life. But one of the aspects of disease history that continuously challenges me, especially after my rigorous training in Foucauldian skepticism here at the Kevorkian Center, is the fact that I find myself wanting the state to do more for public health. I just want it to do it in a fundamentally different way. So I'll end by asking all of you, how can the sharp and painful realization of inequality and vulnerability in our current moment help us to reformulate our grand narratives and uncover different voices in our studies of the Middle East? How can we and should we reconceptualize the historical and contemporary Middle East and North Africa by placing questions of health and disease and the inequalities, social movements, and ambiguous forms of state power that they entail at the center of our work? I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was wonderful. I want to thank both Laura and Alex for some really informative and, couldn't be more timely and presentations that help us think through, everything that we're going through now, which seems unprecedented, but then of course isn't. We're going to move now to the question and answer session. But before we do, I just want to make a quick note that something I should have mentioned at the beginning. This is, for those of you who join us maybe a little bit late, this is our first virtual event at the Kevorkian Center. but we are planning more, and we do have one on the schedule that I hope you all may join us for on June 9th. This is going to be a more contemporary look at responses to COVID-19 in the Middle East, and we'll be joined by Orkideh Behrouzan, who is a medical anthropologist from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and Dr. Amira Roes, who is an epidemiologist who has worked on similar infectious diseases to COVID-19 in the Middle East and Africa. I do hope everyone will be able to join us for that as well. And hopefully, it will be also at noon. Hopefully we can see many of you again then. And just to remind folks, as we move to Q&A, there's three modes for asking a question. You may use the raise your hand function and we will unmute you and then you can ask a question. You can also send a message in the chat publicly or privately to me, and I will ask it for you. I've actually received a number of, I have received a number of private questions, so I might as well just kick things off here. The first question I've received here